Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Nonviolence International YouTube channel. My name is Katherine, and today I'm very excited to be joined by Huwaida Arraf. Huwaida is a human rights lawyer and activist. Um, she's a fantastic leader, and she's a founder of the International Solidarity Movement, as well as the Free Gaza Movement, which uses nonviolent tactics for Palestinian activism. So I'm super excited to have you join us today. She's also a very obviously fantastic woman. Um, and so I was hoping that you could maybe talk a little bit about your background and your parents grew up and they were both lived in Palestine and Israel, as well as you spent a lot of your time in the US and have gotten your education here. So can you talk a little bit about some of your experiences and your background that have led you to being very dedicated and passionate about Palestinian activism?
Yes, thank you. First of all, thank you for having me. It's a real honor and pleasure to be with you. As you said, I was born and raised in the United States, but both my parents are were born in Palestine. My mom in the West Bank town of Beit Sahur, which was and continues to be under Israeli military occupation, and my dad in a Palestinian village that came under Israeli rule in 1948 when Israel established its state. So the Israel took over the village. The Palestinian citizens that were not kicked out, 750,000, became refugees or killed. Um, those that managed to stay in the state became citizens. And so our village is now part of the state of Israel, and we are Palestinian citizens of Israel. They, when it came time for them to start a family, it, I believe my dad doesn't even like to talk about this much, and my mom doesn't either. But their choices were living in Beit Sahur under Israeli military occupation, or living as second or even less than second class citizens within the state of Israel that defines itself as a Jewish state for the Jewish people, completely disregard it. Well, let me not say disregarding, but treating the minority but indigenous Palestinian population as a fifth column, as a barely tolerated minority. And so we are discriminated against inside the state. I'm the oldest of five children. So when it came time to, I think, start their family, they decided to try somewhere else. And my mom had family in the United States, and therefore they headed to the US while my mom was 8 months pregnant with me. And I was born in the US. And I was raised here and with the common notions of freedom and democracy that our country prides itself on. However, my parents did like to take us and keep that connection with Palestine back home. And so on some summers, we would go together to Palestine as a family. And I was exposed to the harsh realities of military occupation, visiting my aunts and uncles in the West Bank and seeing that they couldn't come visit us inside Israel, or they couldn't even go to Jerusalem with us. I remember asking my aunt, like, why can't you go to Jerusalem? It was 15 minutes away. Why can't you come to Jerusalem with us to go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre? And she said, this is America's fault, implying that the United States was supporting Israel in its policies that deprive Palestinians of their freedom. And I know at a young age, I was horrified and what do you mean? And I was a flag waving young Palestinian, but proud American also. But that sparked my curiosity in learning more about the what is happening in my homeland, even though my parents didn't talk about it much growing up, and the US policies that supported Israel. And that's where I ended up focusing my studies. I went to the University of Michigan. When I graduated, I felt that I had a good upbringing, a decent education, a lot of the privileges that most Palestinians are denied by virtue of the fact that they were made refugees by the state of Israel, that they are living under military occupation or living as discriminated citizens in a state that barely tolerates them. And so the question for me became, what can I do? what can I do to contribute to the liberation of my people, the improvement of the situation, a future of peace, being that I had this privileged upbringing because my parents decided to leave. That's not to say that I agreed with their decision to leave. I'm very connected now to Palestine and sometimes question why did they leave? Like, no, you should have stayed. But being a mother myself now and recognizing the question that is always before a parent is, how do you give your child the best that you can give them? I guess I understand it, though sometimes I've thrown that question at my parents before, like, you shouldn't have left. So what happened is I moved to Jerusalem shortly after college. It was to work originally for a conflict resolution program that brought together Israeli and Palestinian youth to talk in the hopes of breaking down barriers and overcoming stereotypes and creating a future of future leaders that could work together. That sounds all nice, and we all like to talk about dialogue and peace and getting along, but it was not long before I realized that this is not only insufficient, it has been detrimental to the Palestinian liberation struggle. And I'll briefly tell you why I came to that conclusion. We would bring Israeli and Palestinian youth together, and they would talk, and they became best friends, and they realized that they loved the same things. They would joke. We would facilitate visits with each other, and they would come also to our center and engage in different projects. But then when it came time for the Palestinian to go back, and the Israelis to go back home, the Israeli would go back home to his or her city or town that was most likely built on top of a destroyed Palestinian village or town. And sometimes they didn't know about it, but we tried to also educate the students about these kinds of things within the history. And then so no problem for the Israeli to just simply catch a bus, drive. We would drive them back to their town. The Palestinian had to go through checkpoint after checkpoint. Sometimes it would take hours. Sometimes they had to go around roadblocks, and a half an hour trip would become a 2-3 hour trip, and checkpoints under the gun of a young soldier that may as well, could have been the brother or sister of their new, Israeli best friend. And these kinds of programs were giving off this picture that it's all about dialoguing and bringing people together to talk about peace and how they don't really hate each other. And they didn't, because that's not the problem. The problem is that they can't get along. The problem is the Israeli policies of colonization, of apartheid that exist on the ground. And these kinds of programs were not addressing that. And they were giving a false impression that led a lot of people to disregard the Palestinian protests and look at supporting these conflict resolution or normalization projects. And that's why I say not only was it not sufficient, it became detrimental. And now I'm kind of firmly against these kind of programs unless you're bringing people together to actively work to change the political situation on the ground, because only when the political situation changes and Palestinians are liberated, then you can talk about building a future together. So I eventually resigned from that program and became very involved in joining Palestinian protests when the first intifada, it was the second intifada that broke out in September of 2000. Palestinians took to the streets, protesting. Originally, it was, a very provocative visit by an Israeli leader who had blood on his hands to the holiest Muslim site in Jerusalem. But the protests were about more than that. They were about years of a facade of a peace process. We were in the time of the Oslo peace process, where Palestinians had invested their hopes in the kind of promise of freedom and a state on only 22% of our historic homeland. But that's, what the Palestinian leadership decided to accept for the promise of freedom and peace. And during that time that we were supposedly in a peace process, Israel continued colonizing, continued building settlements, demolishing Palestinian homes, stealing more Palestinian land, restricting freedom of movement. So when Palestinians finally said enough, it was this rejection of the facade of a peace process or being part of this and saying, we enough of this occupation, we want freedom. And so I joined these protests, and we were met with lethal military force. Here are students, elderly, kids marching together, unarmed, and heavily clad and armed Israeli soldiers would be shooting at us. And so within the first month of these protests, by the end of October 2000, 127 Palestinians had been shot dead. And a report by an Israeli journalist at the time called this a shoot to kill policy. It was shown that about 80% of the lethal wounds were to the head and neck area. So Israel wasn't just trying to, what they say, quell a riot, or this was a shoot to kill policy. And they were able to get away with it because they so dehumanized Palestinian lives. And in the mainstream media, Palestinians were terrorists, or at best, they had decided to turn their backs on the peace process and start this intifada. And so essentially, Palestinians were being blamed for their own death, and nobody was holding Israel accountable. So within a month of these protests, the unarmed protests died down. There were still some, but not as much as it was. And those within Palestinian society that had arms, some of the political factions, security forces, started using them to shoot at checkpoints, to shoot at settlers, or in ways that didn't make much strategic sense. I mean, Palestinians don't have a military. They are no match for one of the most powerful militaries in the world. But it was, I guess, a frustration and a desperation of some way to fight back. And that's where I was thinking, where's my role? I mean, I can't pick up a gun. I also don't think it's very smart. I mean, I understood why people were driven to that, but I didn't think that that's how we were going to win. So in searching for ways to do something, I started with other internationals, with Israelis, with Palestinian organizers, this idea of calling internationals from around the world to come join us in Palestine. Let's try to globalize the Intifada. And by bringing internationals, I had this dream of thousands of people just forming these human barricades and standing up to the Israeli military and not allowing them to invade Palestinian villages. And that's what we organized based around, this idea that maybe we'll get thousands here and it'll be just a historic revolutionary people's movement to free Palestine. And we launched our first campaign in August of 2001. We did not get the thousands of people I had imagined. We didn't even get hundreds of people. We got about 50 volunteers mainly from the United States and the UK. But it was a very promising, inspiring campaign where we internationals, some Israelis and Palestinians together, actively challenged Israel's policies. They'd put up roadblocks, we'd dismantle them. They have checkpoints, we'd march to go past them. And when those volunteers that came to join us went back to their home countries, they had their pictures, they had their stories, and they were telling people about it. And they were asking us, when can we send our friends? Like, when is your next campaign? And so those of us on the ground were like, great, let's plan another campaign. And we did, and more people came. And then we planned another campaign, and people continued coming. It was great. It was really spurred on by the experiences of people from all over the world. What worked in other countries, ideas, but it was led by the Palestinians on the ground because obviously they're the ones most affected. Where we cannot go into a town or village and impose something. It was, what can we do? How can we join you? And I always say we had a 4-prong strategy. Like, the benefits of the international solidarity movement was, one, to provide protective accompaniment, because when Palestinians were protesting alone, as I explained at the beginning of the Intifada, shot dead, no accountability. we thought if there were internationals with Palestinians, maybe the Israeli military wouldn't use lethal force. Maybe they'd use less lethal forms of violence. So it could be a protective presence. We could, number two, change the way the mainstream media was reporting on what's happening. I mean, this is not Palestinians that want to drive Israelis or Jews into the sea. This is not even a religious Jewish versus Muslim Christian conflict. It is an occupied people that want to be free and are demanding liberation, freedom, equality, equal rights, all of which are being denied. And therefore, whatever religion, whatever background, nationality you are, you can stand on the Palestinian side. So we wanted that message transmitted, to the mainstream international media. And then when the people go back home, the volunteers, they tell people word of mouth. If mainstream media isn't going to report it, people will report it to each other and spread the word that way. And now with social media, we have even another venue. We didn't really have that back when we started. And the fourth element or the fourth prong is really the hope that an international presence gives to Palestinians, because Palestinians living in the situation where they are up against one of the most powerful militaries in the world that essentially wants to get rid of them. I mean, Israel wants the land without the people. So it is a policy of literally extermination. Let's see how how packed we can tightly we can pack them, the Palestinians, so we can take over more land and move them into smaller and smaller spaces, or get them to leave. And the people's movement is so restricted. I mean, in Gaza, what people eat is dictated by the Israeli military. I mean, what did they let into Gaza that day and what did they not let into Gaza that day? So the lives are so controlled. Apparently, people feel abandoned by the international community, because I taught law for a year at a Palestinian law school. And I remember the students telling me, I mean, these international human rights, all great and everything, but they don't apply to us. And why do people think that? Because when there is no enforcement mechanism, which is a problem in international law, right? It's kind of if you are powerful, you can enforce, but a general enforcement mechanism so that it is protecting, the law is protecting the rights of the weak and the abused. It's not there. And so that's what Palestinians see. Israel's violating all these laws and nobody's doing anything about it. But internationals, people coming, leaving the comforts of their own home to come to the occupied Palestinian territory, to go to Palestinian villages and to march with them and possibly be arrested by Israeli soldiers, sometimes being shot at, killed. Not that we want that to happen to anybody, but Palestinians saw that as somebody cares, and I think it gave a little bit of hope. And they know that also when the people go back to their own home countries, they're getting the message out, and that also gives you a little bit of hope. And then the people getting the message out can also mobilize to change policies of their own governments that are supporting Israel unconditionally, and allows it to continue. That all is what the ISM is about. In the past, we've been around for about 20 years now. Thousands. We've lost count of the number of volunteers that have come through and that are all back in their home countries now. Some try to visit again, but even if they don't, they're constantly advocating. They've taken up the Palestinian call for global boycott, divestment, and sanctions in order to put pressure on Israel to end its policies and to respect Palestinian human rights and international law. So that's a long way of telling you what got me involved, how I got involved. And it was really looking what can I do? And this was one thing, having the connection, being born and raised in the US, I felt like I could reach out to people, try to connect them with my people back home and see what would come of that. And it was kind of organic like that.
That's so amazing how you managed to globalize a movement that you saw was so small and only taken up by Palestinians, but like you were managed to get it. So lots of people from your own home in the US got involved. I think that's crazy.
Yeah, the history of international solidarity with Palestinians is actually rich, but two things. One, when Palestinians signed the Oslo peace process with Israel, I think the Palestinian leadership moved from a liberation movement, the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was historically outside of Palestine, leading kind of a liberation movement that took various forms. I mean, sometimes it was violent, sometimes it was not, but it was a movement focused on liberating the land. And a land not just for Palestinians, but a land for all the people that want to live there. When they accepted this idea of a two-state solution and signed the Oslo Peace Accords with Israel, that created the Palestinian Authority, which is this administrative body that governs a small part of the West Bank. Uh, the mentality shifted, I would say, into one of state building and negotiating when we didn't have a state. And the focus on the international solidarity kind of died down as they just put all the eggs in the basket of these peace accords, with the U.S. being a mediator, and it was not a neutral mediator, and Israel not really abiding by the accords. And I think that put Palestinian leadership in a tough position. But international solidarity, I think, was ignored for a long time by the Palestinian leadership, who had before invested a lot of time and energy in harnessing that. I mean, the history of the Palestine Liberation Organization with the African National Congress, with the Irish also, that were fighting for the liberation of Ireland, and for other liberation movements, it is rich. And we can read about that, but there was a period where it was almost absent. And so starting that up again, and also in a different way, it wasn't just about, we were calling people to come and stand with Palestinians in actively challenging Israel's policies, getting in the way of their policies, defying. So it is nonviolent direct action. And I don't know that there was very much of that historically. There was solidarity in a lot of different ways, but in coming and standing up, linking arms with Palestinians, standing up to Israeli soldiers, or actively interfering in Israeli military operations side by side with Palestinians, I don't think that before it had taken that form. And that's what we wanted to do.
Gotcha. Honestly, it's amazing. And I think another question I have for you sort of ties back into the role that people from around the world have in all of these movements. And lots of people are very passionate about human rights. They just don't know how to get involved. So can you talk about maybe some advice you have and how to use your passion for human rights to actually make change?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've said before many times when talking to people, you don't have to actually go to Palestine. We also did the boats to Gaza, which, if we have time, I can talk about a little bit. You don't have to be on a boat. You have to decide where you want to be and where your strengths are. Because there is a lot to do from where you are. For example, when we were taking the boats to Gaza, we were actively defying an Israeli naval blockade on the Gaza Strip. We had a small boat up against the Israeli Navy. And we would have been blown out of the water if it wasn't for all of the people back home that were watching us, that were contacting their media and contacting their members of Congress and demanding our kind of safe passage. Without that force, we would have been a few people in the middle of the water up against a military that probably didn't care much what happened to us. So it all works together. There are people doing work on the ground, and they need that support. So if you're interested specifically in Palestine, and I hope that viewers are, for example, Palestinians have put out a call in 2004, 2005 for global boycott, divestment, and sanctions. It is modeled on the movement against apartheid in South Africa. And what we're asking people to do is to take up in their local spaces boycotts of companies that support the Israeli colonization and occupation of Palestinian land. And there are websites with information and resources about how to do that in your unions, at your school, in your place of work, at your local supermarkets that carry certain products. And then also work on divesting and hopefully moving into pushing our governments to sanction Israel, but also with other human rights movements around the world. And I believe that we all should try to be as aware as we are. We can't do everything, but we can try to do a little bit, as much as we can, where we are. And I think justice is universal. And has been said by many greats before, I mean, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And that the connection that we can build with each other, I think reverberates, so that when someone is demonstrating in the streets of St. Louis or Washington, D.C., it can be supported on the streets of Jerusalem in Palestine, or if you're going to Saudi Arabia, or Colombia, wherever you are. It is actually a beautiful thing, and we can tie that together, because the forces that oppress us are also usually connected by the benefits that they get from financial power, and suppressing certain people, exploiting resources, etc. The private companies that profit, those that were building the wall on the US-Mexico border, are the same that are building the wall, or that built the wall in Palestine. So the people that are oppressed by these policies joining forces are very important. So to go back to the essence of your question, how do you figure out what to do? I think figure out where your strengths are and where you want to be. So for example, if you are in a period in your life where you're not necessarily tied here or wherever you are, and you can pick up and go somewhere, for example, you want to go to Palestine, or you want to go to the Western Sahara, or you want to go, you can make connections with organizations there. For example, you can find the International Solidarity Movement on the website. How do I go volunteer with you or with other organizations? And when you're there, you can also make connections, because being there, you learn the intricacies a lot more. But if you can't be there, we can connect on social media. We can connect to human rights organizations or social groups that are doing something about it here also. If you're a good writer, for example, writing pieces to be published about the human rights situation somewhere and why it should matter to us. If you have a strong social media following, or even if you don't, participating in these social media campaigns that are meant to help expose and help educate about the situation. It's a personal decision for everyone. But what I say is, figure out what you're good at and where you want to be at the time of your life where you are. With ISM, we found out that a lot of the volunteers we got were usually between, maybe just finished college, figuring out what their next stage in life is, or had just raised their kids, had gone off to college, or a little bit older, and had the time to actually volunteer. And those that were not starting off career, parents, still had young kids, were supporting back home in the ways that they could with local campaigns. But there's so many ways to connect to people doing work locally and in the countries or in the places affected. And they are very often, they can tell you what they need. I don't know if that was a satisfactory answer.
No, it was. And I think that it's so important that you said that, because there is a place for everyone. And I feel like just making that initial step to get involved actually helps everyone feel more passionate about it, because the more the more you're involved in something, makes you feel more passionate about the outcome. So I think that that's absolutely important. And
That's it. It's the question of, what can I do? And a crazy idea might develop into something that's not so crazy, and that gives a lot of hope to people. Not that all ideas will work, but it's about figuring out what can you do from where you are. And sometimes it could be a big action. Sometimes it's just writing a letter, sending a tweet, but there's always something that everybody can do.
yeah, I think that's a great note to end on. I want to say thank you so much for speaking to me. And also, you're absolutely an inspiration, also, especially for women everywhere like me. So thank you so much for coming to speak with me. And also, thank you so much for your work in Palestinian activism. You're certainly making a difference. And it's been wonderful hearing from you.
Thank you so much. It was great being with you. I appreciate the space. First and foremost, to talk about what's happening in Palestine, and hopefully what people can do about it. I hope people do take the time to learn more and get involved.
Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely. So thank you everyone for listening, and thank you for coming to the Spotlight series. If you think these conversations are important and would like to see them continue, please consider supporting Nonviolence International and the work that we do by subscribing to this YouTube channel and following us on social media. You can also help us make a change through donation. And remember, every little bit counts and can help build a world of nonviolence.